This is Eastern State Penitentiary. From the years 1829 through 1971, it was a functional prison. Now it's a museum. I'm here today because they're having a flea market just outside its walls. I'm not looking for anything in particular, really just browsing. The only thing that's really off limits is guitars. I think I have enough at this point. Oh no. What's this? Okay, so I just bought this for $15. For the record, I lasted 7 minutes at this flea market without buying a guitar. I got it mostly because it just looks so awful. It's sort of funny. I'm guessing someone was trying to build an electric guitar and they just never finished. Maybe we can finish the project for them. Now that I'm back home, I'm gonna try to order some parts for this thing. Obviously, this body shape is reminiscent of a Telecaster, but there are several slight differences between this and the Fender version of that guitar. Because of this, I have the sneaking suspicion that Fender-style parts won't actually fit. Nonetheless, I've just ordered a Telecaster pickguard, bridge, control plate, and pickups. I'm going with the cheapest version of everything because I don't even know if this is a viable instrument yet. Anyway, all those parts should be arriving tomorrow. Okay, 2 days have passed and all of the parts have arrived. The first thing I'm going to do is hold up the pickguard I bought against the body and see if it fits at all. You know, this might actually work. Of course, the screw holes won't line up at all, so I'll probably have to drill into the body, but that's really not a big deal. Let's try the bridge next. That kind of fits. Again, the screw holes really don't line up. Even so, seeing these parts on the body, I'm way more optimistic about this project now than I was a few days ago. Okay, let's try to screw the pickups in. The neck pickup goes into the pickguard, and the bridge pickup gets held in by the bridge. One thing I'm discovering is that the cavity holes on this guitar are very shallow. The screws on this bridge pickup are pretty long, and they actually hit against the body, preventing me from actually screwing the bridge down. To solve this, I'm actually going to cut those screws in half. There's really no reason for them to be so long anyway. Next, it's time to try this metal control plate. It fits, but I'm seeing a huge problem. Up until now, I've been using Fender-style Telecaster parts, and they kind of fit, but this guitar isn't really a Telecaster. The way you plug in an actual Fender Telecaster is there's a jack on the side. This instrument's body is much thinner, and it doesn't have a hole for the jack. I'm guessing whoever was building this was planning for the jack to come out of that control plate, like it does on a Fender Mustang. But of course, this control plate doesn't have a hole. I'm going to do a web search and just see if there are other Telecasters that work this way. Seems like there are a few hits. Let's check this one out. Okay, so here is an example of exactly what I imagined. This guitar has an output jack right on that control plate. Actually, this guitar's neck looks a lot like mine. The neck on my guitar actually has something peculiar that no other guitar I own has. An extra fret right at the top near the nut. This guitar seems to have that too. It even has the same little white piece of plastic on the headstock. Because my guitar looks so rustic, and because there are no identifying marks of any kind, I just assumed this was homemade. But what if it's actually a Japanese guitar that somebody just stripped the paint off of? I'm going to bookmark this listing and we can do some more research in a bit. In the meantime, let's continue putting this instrument together. I drilled a hole in the control plate and I'm going to install a jack. So in the end, it should look just like that photo of a Japanese guitar I found. Next, I'm going to solder the jack to the switch, and I'm also going to solder the pickups to that switch. There's also a ground wire which needs to be attached to the bridge. You know, I think we're finally ready to screw the whole thing together. And now, all that's left to do is put those strings on. Okay, time to give it a spin. Wow, that's super twangy. It's a real classic rock kind of sound, isn't it? I am shocked at how good it feels to play this guitar. The action's extremely low, and it sounds really good. Now that I've decided I like this thing, I really want to know who made it. Unfortunately, the listing I found doesn't have an actual brand name. The person wrote Electra, ? But it was very obviously a guess. Nonetheless, I do think this is a Japanese guitar, so I'm going to do a bunch of research in that direction. And in the meantime, I'm going to put a post on Reddit and see whether or not people agree with my assessment. Next, I'm going to search for Japanese Telecaster copy. Let's limit it to the 1970s. Wow, there are actually a lot of copies of that same cream-colored guitar. And they all seem to have that same front-facing output jack, just like mine. Here's another model, and another model, and another one. So these are all obviously the same guitar, probably made in the same factory, and yet each one has a different brand name. Pretty strange. I'm going to make a list of all the names, and then I can do some research on each one. Okay, I've got my preliminary list done, and it seems that there were no less than 28 different company names used to sell this guitar. And by the way, I'm positive that there are more. In order to figure out who made mine, I need to look for identifying features. First off, the neck has that extra fret I was talking about. After a bit of Googling, I learned that that's called a 0 fret, and it was common on Japanese guitars until about 1972. Going back to my list, I'm able to rule out about 70% of the brand names just by excluding ones that don't have that 0 fret. Another identifying feature is that little plate that covers the truss rod. In the end, I'm only able to find 2 listings that have that exact same truss rod cover. Unfortunately, neither one has a brand name on it. Meanwhile, I've checked in with the sleuths over on Reddit, and somebody has turned up the exact same listing I had already found. It's not new information, but at least it makes me feel like I'm on the right track. Of the names that are still left on my list, one company seems like a particularly strong candidate, Elgar. So I did some digging, and it turns out that they were local. Out in the suburbs of Philadelphia, there was a store called Medley Music, run by a guy named Harry Rosenblum. In the mid to late 50s, Harry built his own acoustic guitars, and the brand name he put on them was Elgar. That was a name he came up with by combining his 2 kids' names, Ellen and Gerson. Harry passed away in 2019, but there's a very short interview with him on the NAMM website.
You know, I was ambitious, and I was willing to work 20 hours a day if I had to, and sometimes I did.
By the early 60s, he realized that he was actually losing money by making his own guitars, so he partnered with a Japanese company, Hoshino Gakki, and he had them make his guitars, which would then be branded Elgar. A lot of Japanese guitars in the 60s had super cool, unique designs, but others were basically copies of Fender and Gibson models. And of course, due to the differences in labor costs, Japanese guitars could be sold for way less than those American brands. Meanwhile, many other music stores developed similar relationships with Japanese manufacturers. You can dig up catalogs for these old stores, and you'll see the same models appearing again and again, each time with new photographs and new model numbers, but otherwise 100% identical. So at first glance, it might seem like what Harry had set up with Hoshino was exactly the kind of overseas outsourcing relationship that we see so much of today. But in his case, there was a twist. In 1971, Hoshino Gakki bought his whole company. In fact, they still exist, and their headquarters is right around here. And the first thing they did after buying the company was to change the name from Elgar to Ibanez, or as many people in the US say, Ibanez. And yeah, we're talking about the same Ibanez company that exists today. If you look in the 1972 Ibanez catalog, you can actually see that same cream-colored guitar listed. Of course, mine has been stripped of its paint. Now obviously what I have here is a pretty loose copy of a Fender Telecaster, which is how come none of the parts I bought fit quite right. Ibanez also made many copies of other guitars, including many versions of the Gibson Les Paul. Their copies weren't actually that close, but nonetheless, in 1977, Gibson's parent company filed a lawsuit against Ibanez right here in Philadelphia. That's a picture of the federal courthouse. Anyway, this legal threat is the reason why, to this very day, Japanese guitars from the mid to late 70s are often referred to as lawsuit guitars. These are all eBay listings that use that term. It's a label that makes them seem very cool and illicit. It's become a mark of distinction, as though these are such good copies that they were actually illegal. The truth is, while many of them really are decent instruments, they're not that close to the guitars they were imitating. And in fact, they have nothing to do with that famous lawsuit. As it happens, the actual legal complaint was only with the shape of the headstock. You see how the top of the headstock on the left looks kind of like the pages of an open book? That's what Gibson had a trademark on. So, of course, Ibanez just settled out of court, swapped out the headstocks on their guitars, and within a year or two, they'd actually changed their entire business model. They started coming up with their own designs, which is what they do today. Coming back to my guitar, I've just discovered that these twangy pickups are actually ideal for palm muting, which makes this guitar perfect for this song I've been working on. I was a young man looking for some new thing I could latch on to. Then I found you. I was your basic, making the baseless lies just to impress you. Instead I depressed you. It's funny, I've never owned a real Telecaster, so I have no idea if they're actually supposed to be this twangy. I will say I'm thrilled with the sound. It's also really neat that this random flea market purchase sent me down such a rabbit hole. When people talk about classic guitars from that period, they often focus on American brands like Fender and Gibson. I suspect that because these Japanese models from the 70s were sold under so many different brand names, they kind of got written off as just poor quality clones. Of course, nowadays, Japanese guitars are highly regarded. Both Fender and Gibson produce instruments in Japan, and they have for a long time. In fact, my Fender Jazzmaster was made in Japan by a company called Fujigen, which, as it happens, is the very same company that Hoshino was using to produce the Elgar guitars way back in the 1970s. In other words, this random flea market guitar may very well have been made in the same factory that made my beloved Fender Jazzmaster. I'll give you 10 guesses as to which cost more. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, it'd be great if you could give it a thumbs up. Also, now is a great time to subscribe. I've got a bunch of interesting videos on the way. I ended up finishing the song I wrote in this video, so make sure you listen to the full thing on Bandcamp. Also, I made a sample library of this guitar processed through a range of different effects. I think it's a really cool sounding library, so definitely make sure you check that out on the Patreon. Speaking of which, the Patreon costs just $5, and at least once a month I upload an exclusive sample library just for patrons. There have been a ton so far. Okay, I think that's it. I'm gonna leave you with the chorus to that song.